Hello viewer, you watching a real chess game, real people. E4, D5, E5, E6, Knight F3, Pawn C6, Pawn D4, Queen C7, Knight C3, Pawn F6, Pawn capture pawn F6, Knight capture pawn F6, Knight E5, Bishop D6, White Bishop G5, Bishop capture Knight E5, Pawn capture Bishop E5, King F8, Pawn capture Bishop Knight F6, Pawn capture Pawn F6, Bishop capture Pawn F6, Rook G8, Queen D3, Knight D7, Bishop E6 check, King F7, Queen H3 check, Knight G7, Queen H5 check, King capture Bishop E7, White King castle, Queen E5, Queen H4, Black Queen check, G5, Queen capture Queen G5, Rook capture Queen G5, Pawn G3, Black Pawn A5, Bishop H3, Pawn A4, Rook E1, Rook G6, Rook capture pawn, Dua check, E6, Rook capture, Rook E6, Bishop capture Rook E6, King capture Bishop E6, Pawn A3, Rook A5, Rook E1 check, King D6, Pawn F4, Knight C5, Pawn D4, Rook A6, Pawn capture, Knight C5 check, King capture pawn C5, King b2, king c4, pawn h3, pawn d4, knight e2, bishop capture, pawn h3, knight g1, bishop e6, rook capture, bishop e6, rook b6 check, king a2, king c3, rook e2, pawn c5, knight f3, rook g6, knight capture, pawn d4, pawn capture, knight d4, rook g2, pawn b5, pawn g4, king c4, pawn f5, rook f6, rook f2, king d5, rook e2, king d6, white king b2, rook f8, rook e4, king c5, rook e5 check, king c4, rook e4, rook g8, pawn c3, king d5, rook capture, pawn d4 check, king c5, rook e4, rook h8, rook e5 check, king c6, rook e6 check. Black is timeout, resign. White is win.